July 1943. Inside a Soviet assault gun, a loader wrestles a 107-pound shell toward the breech. Another man waits with the propellant charge because the ammunition comes in two pieces, and there is barely enough room for either of them to move. The gunner sees a German Ferdinand through his sight. Nearly 8 inches of armor face him. His shell cannot reliably punch through it. He fires anyway. The shell fails to penetrate, and the Ferdinand stops. That is the contradiction at the center of the Soviet 152mm assault gun. For decades, people have judged it by a penetration table and called it either a monster killer or an overrated myth. Both readings miss the same thing. They treat the shell like a drill. It was closer to a wrecking hammer. At Kursk, one Ferdinand was knocked out by a hit from a Soviet 152mm self-propelled gun. The vehicle was later recoverable. Its armor had not been neatly pierced. But inside, blast and Spalling turned the fighting compartment into a lethal place. Spalling is what happens when a heavy blow strikes the outside of armor and fragments break loose from the inside face. No hole is required. Energy arrives first. And energy was what this weapon delivered. The armor-piercing projectile weighed about 107 pounds and left the barrel at roughly 1,970 feet per second. At close range, it could defeat around 5 inches of vertical armor. Farther out, that figure fell quickly. Against a Tiger, that could be enough under favorable conditions. Against the front of a Ferdinand, it usually was not. Against the later King Tiger, the paper answer looked even worse, so if penetration were the only measure, the case would already be closed. But the most important shell was not the armor-piercing round. It was the high explosive one, 96 pounds, more than 13 pounds of TNT inside. A field artillery charge delivered almost horizontally into a vehicle, bunker, or building from direct fire range. Buried in earth, a shell like that could dig a crater roughly 5 feet across and almost as deep. Against a tank, the blast did not need to pass through the armor to dismantle what made the tank function. Road wheels could be torn away. Suspension arms could bend beyond use. Optics could crack or lose alignment. A gun barrel could be damaged. A mantlet could shift. A turret ring could jam. Weld seams could split. The crew could be stunned, wounded, or killed by concussion and fragments while the exterior still looked almost intact. That was not a failed hit. A tank that cannot move is no longer a tank in the tactical sense. A tank that cannot traverse its turret is a fixed gun. A tank with a damaged barrel is a bunker. And a 60-ton German vehicle immobilized under fire becomes a recovery operation so difficult that the battlefield may finish what the shell began. The 152 did not always destroy the armor. It destroyed the machine behind the armor. Soviet trials showed the pattern in steel. In one test, a 152mm armor-piercing shell struck a Panther at long range, ricocheted, and still ripped open a breach large enough for a man to see through. Another high-explosive hit at a similar distance opened the plate instead of neatly perforating it. Against a Ferdinand, a concrete-piercing projectile went through the side. Against its heavy bow, a separate impact broke away a massive section of the front plate. The King Tiger tests were even more revealing. One hit on the upper front did not penetrate. Instead, it drove a deep crater into the plate and burst a major hole weld. A hit lower down went through and split more welded seams around the impact. Another strike at the machine gun mount penetrated and sent a crack running across the armor. The plate thickness had not stopped mattering, but it had stopped being the whole story. A later combat report described 10 rounds fired at a King Tiger for one hit. That single hit struck low on the turret, displaced it on the ring, and tore away part of the side structure when the explosion took effect inside. The result was devastating. The hit rate was not. That matters, because the legend usually keeps the first half and hides the second. This was not a sniper rifle on tracks. It was a howitzer carried inside an armored box. The barrel came from the ML-20, a 152mm gun howitzer adopted before the war as heavy core artillery. In towed form, the weapon weighed around 8 tons and could throw a shell more than 10 miles. But an 8-ton field piece could not follow tanks through an assault. It needed a tractor. It needed time to unlimber. Its crew stood exposed, and at direct fire distance, exposed artillerymen did not live long. Putting the same gun behind armor solved that problem. It let the Red Army drive a heavy artillery piece close enough to attack a strong point face to face. The first vehicle was built with extraordinary speed. A design was selected in December 1942. The prototype began assembly at the end of that month and was completed in only 25 days. Trials started in January. In February 1943, the State Defense Committee accepted it for production. By the time the Battle of Kursk began, the machine was new, scarce, and barely understood. The early version used the KV heavy tank chassis. Later, the same basic fighting idea moved on to the IS heavy tank chassis, creating the vehicle most people now picture when they hear the name ISU-152. Across the war and early post-war production, more than 3,000 of the later type were built. But the timing matters. Only a small number existed in 1943. The weapon that earned its legend at Kursk became a mass battlefield presence mainly in 1944 and 1945. And what it gained in force, it paid for in almost everything else. The ammunition was separate loading, first the projectile, then the propellant charge. Each round demanded men, space, and time. The vehicle carried only about 20 shots. A practical sustained rate could fall to roughly 1.5 rounds per minute. In the time a faster German tank destroyer could fire several times, the Soviet crew might still be wrestling the next projectile into position. The gun had very little horizontal traverse. If the target moved outside that narrow arc, the driver had to turn the entire 50-ton vehicle while the commander talked him onto the target. The trajectory was curved. The sights and mount were not designed for quick snapshots at moving armor. Direct fire against a tank became realistic only at relatively short range, and short range was exactly where the vehicle's own armor became vulnerable. This is the darkest part of the legend. Used as a dedicated tank hunter, the 152 was clumsy, slow, exposed, and badly outpaced. Its huge shell could end a fight with one hit. But getting that hit was the problem. Reloading all 20 rounds took more than 40 minutes of brutal labor. Lifting projectiles weighing close to 100 pounds up over the hull and down through roof hatches. A vehicle that emptied its racks could disappear from the battle for most of an hour. Crews often tried to carry extra ammunition wherever space allowed. That created another danger, because a fuel tank sat inside the fighting compartment with the men and shells. When enemy fire did penetrate, the result could be catastrophic. The crew worked around the breech of a core artillery gun in a compartment too low, too narrow, and too crowded for comfort. The machine was protected enough to approach a fortified position. It was not protected enough to trade repeated shots with a Tiger. At 1.5 rounds per minute, trading shots was never a sensible plan. And that is the clue. The Red Army had another weapon on nearly the same heavy chassis. Instead of the 152mm howitzer, it carried a 122mm high-velocity gun. That gun fired flatter. It was more accurate against armor. It penetrated more plate at range. Its ammunition was easier to handle. Its crew could fire faster. When the Soviets wanted a heavy self-propelled gun better suited to killing tanks, they had one, and they built thousands of it. So why keep the 152? Because the 122 could not do what a 96-pound high-explosive shell did to a bunker, a fortified house, or the ground floor of a city block. There is the real identity of the machine. It was not born as a tank destroyer. It was an assault gun. Its targets were concrete, timber, brick, gun positions, barricades, fortified buildings, and trench systems. The ammunition load proves it. A typical combat stowage favored high-explosive rounds over armor-piercing or concrete-piercing ammunition. The organization proves it too. These vehicles served in independent heavy self-propelled artillery regiments. Despite the word artillery, they often fought in direct fire, following the leading heavy tanks at close distance. Not first in the column, not far behind, close enough to see the target through the sight, far enough back that the first anti-tank gun would engage something else. Then the 152 would answer. A direct hit into a defended room did not simply clear the room. It could remove the room. Against concrete, the heavy projectile could break the fighting position open. Against a barricade, it could create the path the tanks and infantry needed. In the battles for the cities of 1945, that was why commanders wanted these vehicles. Not because they were elegant tank hunters, because they were mobile demolition guns. This also changes the famous Kursk story. The 1st Regiment equipped with the new assault gun entered combat in July 1943. Wartime claims credited it with destroying large numbers of Tigers and Ferdinands in a matter of days. Those claims built the reputation. They were also far larger than the surviving German loss and repair record supports. Only a few dozen of the Soviet machines were present in the entire battle. German Ferdinands were lost heavily to mines, breakdowns, and the impossibility of recovering disabled vehicles under fire. Many that looked destroyed from the Soviet side were later repaired and returned to service. That does not mean the Soviet crews invented what they saw. On a battlefield, through a narrow sight, smoke and dust turn identification into guesswork. A stopped vehicle may look destroyed. A damaged vehicle may be recovered at night. Different guns may claim the same target. The legend grew because the weapon's real effects were hard to classify. A shell might not penetrate. The target might not burn. But the turret no longer moved, the crew no longer fought, or the tracks no longer turned. Was that a kill? To the recovery unit, maybe not. To the infantry advancing past it, absolutely. Even the nickname arrived before the proof. Zveroboy is often translated as Beast Killer. The name was genuinely used during the war, but it began as the battle name of an individual gun before that vehicle had even fired in combat. The title came first, then propaganda, battlefield rumor, and later retellings built the record around it. The most dramatic version says the 152 could blow the turret clean off a Tiger. That line is repeated constantly. Primary evidence for it is not. What the surviving reports do support is less cinematic and more mechanically disturbing. Welds opening along their seams, armor plates cracking around mounts, turrets shifted on their rings, running gear wrecked, sights blinded, crews incapacitated behind armor that still looked whole. The gun did not need to throw a turret through the air. It could break the tank from the outside in. By 1945, Soviet designers tried to improve the vehicle with a more heavily sloped superstructure. The prototype offered extraordinary protection around the gun, but the armor stole too much internal space. The loaders could no longer work the giant separate loading ammunition efficiently. That was the final engineering trap. Protection and rate of fire were fighting for the same cubic feet. The shell demanded the room. The design could not give it more armor without taking away the human space needed to serve the gun. So the wartime machine remained what necessity had made it. A heavy artillery piece, a cramped armored compartment, a small ammunition load, a slow crew under enormous physical strain, and one shell powerful enough to make all those compromises worthwhile when it struck the right target. Its final wartime use came in Manchuria against Japanese fortified positions. That ending fits better than the nickname ever did. A weapon remembered for hunting tigers finished the war doing what it had been built to do, breaking fortifications. Post-war modernization gave the vehicle more ammunition, better sights, improved radios, and greater range. Some remained in service for decades, but its historical meaning was already fixed. The 152 was not a precision anti-tank gun. Judged as one, it was slow, inaccurate, short on ammunition, and tactically awkward. Judged as a siege gun given tracks and armor, it was one of the most brutal solutions of the war. The penetration table asked whether the shell could make a hole. The battlefield asked whether the target could still fight. Those were never the same question. The 152 did not have to pierce the beast. It only had to make the beast stop being a machine.